Hi, everyone, and welcome. My name is Brian Rax. I'm a creative economy researcher and network member. I'm based here at the University of Southampton in the UK. It's really my privilege to chair the session today and to welcome all of you to the sixth and final seminar of the ReCrea, which is the Researching Creative Economies in Africa, Sharing Knowledge, Methods, and Practices, this seminar series, which is promoted by the Africa-Europe Cluster of Research Excellence on Creative Economies and funded by a Circle U seed funding grant. The initiative aims to bring together current research from a range of different disciplines, which explores the values, dynamics, and impact of creative economies in Africa. We've hosted a range of seminars this year, and these are available online through our YouTube channel. And we have more activities planned for 2026, so you can register to receive our newsletter or follow our social media channels if you want to know more about future seminars, also publications and activities. Now, I'm very pleased to introduce our speaker for today, Dr. Folakemi Ogungbe, who is Senior Lecturer in the Department of Film and Multimedia at the School of Media and Communications within the Pan-Atlantic University, which is based in Nigeria. She holds a PhD in film studies from the University of Ibadan and is currently, in a very cold part of the world, a fellow of the University of Michigan African Scholars Program. Folakemi's talk today is entitled Real History, Exploring Nigerian Historical Films as Windows into the Nation's Past. She'll speak for about 35 or 40 minutes, and then we will have about 10 or 15 minutes for questions at the end. So again, thanks everyone for coming, and over to you, Folakemi, to share your slides and get started when you're ready. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Brian. Thank you for having me. I feel so privileged. You said the last of the lectures in the series. Wow, I feel really lucky to be the one given the last. Thank you everybody for joining. I'm going to be sharing my slides now. Thank you. I think we're good. We're good. Yeah. All right, everybody. The title of my presentation is Real History, Exploring Nigerian Historical Film as Windows into the Nation's Past. Real Nigeria, Exploring Nigerian Historical Film. So if there's an error there, it's actually Real History, Exploring Nigerian Historical Films as Windows into the Nation's Past. So the question I want to ask as I start is, what gets to tell a nation's history when archives are fragile, silences are deep, and the history disappeared for a while from secondary school curricula, and the past is generally contested? And what happens when films, not textbooks now and not museums, become the primary way people encounter the past? Now, these questions sit at the heart of my argument today, that in Nigeria, real history has become real memory. Historical cinema in Nigeria has emerged as one of the most influential cultural forms through which the nation imagines, reconstructs, and negotiates its past. Nigerian audiences often first encounter the past, not through monograph museums or state archives, but through Nollywood's audiovisual renderings. These films circulate widely across class, region, and education level, and they generate a shared pool of images, characters, moral lessons, and historical imaginaries. But Nigerian historical cinema does not emerge from ideal well-resourced conditions. It arises from a production ecosystem that is defined by improvisation, infrastructural scarcity, and creative constraints. Sometimes you find generators humming under dialogue tracks. Sometimes they have to import props because the national institutions have failed to preserve them. Location permissions sometimes change at the last minute. Actors arrive late because of Lagos traffic. There is fear of political backlash sometimes, and this quietly shapes the narrative choices. Now, in this environment, filmmakers are not simply storytellers. They become public historians, archivists, and cultural custodians. They are working with limited tools to build a memory infrastructure for the nation. Now, this paper expands my earlier colloquium work. Actually, I've been working on this for a while, first as my PhD thesis. The arguments keep getting more, sharper each time. So the paper expands from my earlier colloquium work and forms a chapter of my book project, tentatively titled Real Nigeria, Nollywood History and Cultural Memory. And it brings together textual analysis, theoretical framing, and ethnographic insights drawn from interviews and production observations. And it advances the argument that Nigerian historical cinema is not merely representational, it is constitutive. It actively produces memory, reorganizes heritage, mediates national trauma, and fills archival absences. Now, in a landscape where the real, REAL, past, is inaccessible, whether materially, politically, or even emotionally, the real, REEL, becomes a crucial window into the nation's imagined and remembered history. Through three primary case studies, Evasion 1897, October 1 and 76, the paper examines how Nigerian directors interpret the past and the ways in which production constraints shape, distort, or enrich historical representation. And each film, though distinct in genre and intention, highlights a similar paradox. The very limitations that hinder perfect historical reconstruction also create distinctive aesthetic signatures. So scarcity becomes method, constraint becomes authorship, and improvisation becomes a historiographic tool. But before I delve into the theoretical frameworks and case studies, it is essential to ground this discussion in three illustrative stories that show with clarity and simplicity how Nigerian films shape cultural memory far beyond the screen. And the first story is about Efunsetan Aniwura. Efunsetan Aniwura, and I'm titling it Cinema as Cultural Memory in Motion. Now, in Yoruba memory, few figures illustrate the mutability of historical interpretation as vividly as Efunsetan Aniwura, who is a 19th century Iyalode of Ibadan. Historically, Efunsetan was a wealthy merchant, a political strategist, a landholder, and leader whose power rivaled male chiefs. Yet, in Akinwumi Ishola's 1970 play, which was later adapted into film, she is recast as a tyrannical, emotionally unstable matriarch whose cruelty leads to divine punishment. Now, this reframing did not remain in the realm of performance. Over time, Ishola's moralized depiction overshadowed the historical accounts, shaping public perception so powerfully that a statue in Ibadan was eventually removed, justified not by any archival evidence, but by the narrative logic of the drama. Here, performance becomes historiography, the play becomes archive, cinema becomes moral authority. And Efunsetan's story demonstrates that in Nigeria, film and performances do not merely retell history, they can overwrite it. The second story is Oleku, when cinema revives a historical aesthetic. Tunde Kelani's Oleku, adapted from Ishola's 1974 novel, reconstructs 1970s Ibadan with such nostalgic precision that it effectively revived dormant cultural practices. Shot with meticulous attention to costume, music, campus life and urban textures, the film freezes an era and it reintroduces it to contemporary society. The result is that the Oleku fashion, the short buba and tightly wrapped mini hero, returned to mainstream popularity. What had been a fading 1970s fashion became a symbol of cultural pride in the 2000s. Cinema here does more than depict culture. It reanimates it. Memory becomes fashion. Aesthetic nostalgia becomes lived identity. And the third story is the Igwe trope. If you have watched Nollywood films, you will sometimes hear them say Igwe. Now, when fiction creates social facts, in Igbo pre-colonial governance, scholars consistently document decentralized republican political structures with no central monarchies. Yet Nollywood repeatedly portrays Igbo kings called Igwe as absolute rulers. Igwe originally means sky or high as the sky and was first used to depict the colonial warring chiefs before it was popularized by Nollywood. Over the years, this fictional monarchy became normalized in the public imagination. The most dramatic example is the rise of a self-declared Igwe of the Igbos in Ghana, a man whose claim felt natural to many because Nollywood had already trained audiences to accept that Igbo society could indeed have a supreme monarch. So here, cinematic invention becomes social reality, film creates political possibility, and myth becomes lived experience. So why do these stories matter? These stories reveal a critical truth. In Nigeria, audiovisual storytelling is not passive reflection. It is active memory making. Film alters perception. Film shapes collective consciousness. Film becomes the people's archive. And they also set the stage for the central argument of the paper, which is that Nigerian historical cinema operates within the conditions of scarcity and improvisation that profoundly shape how history is represented and remembered. Quickly to the theoretical frameworks and methods. Nigerian historical cinema sits at the intersection of multiple intellectual traditions. We have historiography, African performance cultures, collective memory studies, and post-colonial film theory. Now, to understand the epistemic work these films perform, we must examine the theoretical lenses through which real history, REEL, can be understood. Three frameworks guide this analysis. These are the frame theory, the collective memory theory, and the African film traditions as counter archives. Now, for frame theory and the cinematic construction of the past. Frame theory derived from the work of Gregory Bateson and later Evan Goffman and Robert Entman provides a powerful tool for analyzing how film structure meanings. A frame determines what is selected, what is emphasized, what is hidden or marginalized, and what moral judgment is encouraged. Frames shape not only the viewer's perception, but also the interpretative logic through which events are understood. They function like cognitive scaffolding, guiding audiences towards the preferred meaning without explicit instruction. In Nigerian historical films, framing becomes historiography. For example, in Invasion 1897, the central frame is that of Benin sovereignty and colonial brutality. British characters are framed as arrogant aggressors. The Benin Kingdom is framed as culturally sophisticated but violated. This framing is not neutral. It is intentional historiographic intervention that counters colonial archival narratives which justify the punitive expedition as a civilizing gesture. In October 1, the frame revolves around ambivalence and unease. The contradiction of nationhood forged amid violence, mistrust, and elite control. The audience is guided to see independence not as triumph, but as a moment of hidden rupture. In 76, Izuojuku frames the coup through domestic lens, guiding the audience to see political turmoil through the emotional experiences of women and families, rather than through the grandiose rhetoric of military authority. So why frame theory matters for real history? Because Nigeria lacks a singular state-endorsed narrative of its past, due to so many reasons: political instability, curricular gaps, archival fragmentation. Films like these often become the de facto frames through which citizens understand the past. The frame becomes the fact, the fiction becomes memory. The second theory, collective memory theory, is looking at how society remembers through images. Halbwachs' foundational work on collective memory reminds us that memory is not individual, it is social. Groups remember together using cultural materials to negotiate identity and belonging. Assmann's later distinction between communicative memory and cultural memory enhances this understanding. Communicative memory circulates in every conversation, in everyday conversation, and they are informal and generational, lasting between 80 to 100 years. Cultural memory, on the other hand, are institutionalized through museums, monuments, texts, and so on, and they are stabilized and preserved beyond living generations. But in Nigeria, where museums are underfunded, textbooks sometimes are superficial, and formal archives are really weak, cinema becomes cultural memory in motion. Film as archive. Historical films in Nigeria substitute for institutional memory because they commemorate events that the state has not officially memorialized. They preserve cultural practices that everyday life has abandoned. They revive languages, fashion, and political debates. They create emotional archives by embodying trauma and joy. For example, in Evasion 1897, the film becomes a cinematic memory for colonial violence. October 1 becomes the default visual archive of independence for younger generation. 76 becomes an emotional archive of military rule, remembering the coup through the domestic sphere. So why does Assmann matter for Nigeria? Nigeria's memory regime is not anchored in stable institutions. So instead, it is diffuse across oral tradition, like I said earlier. Oral traditions, religious narrative, social media, and even Nollywood, of course. So in this context, films do not supplement cultural memory, they are cultural memory. The third lens is African film traditions as counter archives. African cinema has long functioned as an act of resistance against colonial historiography. We've had directors like Usman Sembène, Sarah Maldoro, Med Hondo, Gerima, Sisako, Kabore. They've all used film as a decolonial tool, a means to reclaim African subjectivity, correct colonial distortions, archive indigenous language, and critique state violence. They also use this film to teach political consciousness. Now, this intellectual lineage also shaped Nollywood's approach, even though Nollywood differs in industrial structures, aesthetics, and production culture. Now, let's look at Nollywood's contribution to the counter-archive tradition. Nollywood does not always engage in overt political cinema like Sembène. Instead, its contribution emerges through, number one, popular access. It reaches millions, including non-literate audiences. Number two, narrative abundance. It produces a staggering volume of stories, including historical retellings. And then cultural embeddedness. Its stories circulate in homes, buses, and everywhere. Markets, on social media, people are discussing. Oral aesthetic continuity. Nollywood inherits Yoruba, Igbo, Hausa, Edo, and indeed, all the ethnicities that are in Nigeria in the storytelling modes. When a Nollywood film reconstructs the past, it does not merely represent it, it participates in the African historiographic practice. So I'll look at Nigeria's production ecology, constraint as method. Nigeria's filmmaking environment is defined by so many factors: unreliable electricity, high generator costs, fuel costs, traffic delays, low funding, area boys demanding security money, scarcity of period props, inconsistent weather, unpredictable noise, weak institutional support, and so on and so forth. These are not inconveniences, these are historiographic forces. In Invasion 1897, lack of access to authentic artifacts forces stylation, which becomes a visual rhetoric of loss. In October 1, the struggle to source 1960s materials becomes evidence of national forgetting. The absence of archives becomes text. Kunle Afolayan told me that he had to get the archives, the props that he used for October 1 from Amazon. He had to ship them to Nigeria because he couldn't find them anywhere in Nigeria. In 76, censorship anxiety shapes the representation of violence, resulting in a memory frame through intimacy rather than spectacle. Izojuku was running away from showing violence on screen because he was scared of censorship. So this leads to a theoretical claim. African historical cinema is not simply limited by constraint, it is authored by constraint. Now, this claim draws on Brian Larkin's analysis of media infrastructures in northern Nigeria in 2008, which suggests that infrastructural fragility, piracy, and informal circulation do not merely restrict film practice, they shape its very aesthetics and narrative possibility. So scarcity becomes a visual language, improvisation becomes method, material conditions shape cultural memory. So rather than understanding Nollywood through deficit language of lack, of failure, inferior budgets, and so on and so forth, it is more intellectually productive to understand how material scarcity becomes a unique mode of memory production. These insights anchors the case studies that follows now. How Nigerian films reconstruct the past under constraints. Now, I'm going to be looking at three major historical films, like I said earlier, and how they construct narrative memory within the tension of scarcity, political sensitivity, and so on. So each film demonstrates how real history emerges from an interplay between an artistic imagination, ethical decision-making, infrastructural limitation, and collective memory needs. So these case studies are not chosen for popularity. They are chosen because each offers a different mode of historical intervention. When we look at Invasion 1897, we think of anti-colonial restitution cinema. When we look at October 1, we're thinking of post-colonial ambivalence cinema, and 76, post-military emotional cinema. Together, they form a triangulated picture of how Nigeria negotiates the past through film. So for case study one, quickly, Lancelot Odua Imaswen's Invasion 1897, made in 2014, is one of the most assertively political Nigerian historical films of the last decade. It reconstructs the 1897 British punitive expedition against the Benin Kingdom, foregrounding the violence of colonial plunder and reframing the Benin bronzes as records and not art objects. Now, this distinction is essential to the film's ideological position. The bronzes are documents, testimonies, archives, African historiography rendered in bronze. Some themes that come up. The first is reframing the colonial archive. Colonial records describe the discussion of Benin as a civilizing mission, like I said earlier, against a barbaric kingdom. Invasion 1897 reframes or reverses this frame. The British are portrayed as looters, motivated by greed and imperial arrogance. The Benin court is depicted as sophisticated, culturally advanced, and wronged. This reversal is not a mere ideological repositioning, it's a direct challenge to Western archival dominance. The colonial archive claims authority because it is written. Invasion 1897 claims authority because it is embodied and visual, which is closer to how the Benin memory was traditionally transmitted, even through the bronzes. The second theme is the courtroom as archive. The film employs a courtroom framing device where a Nigerian scholar is tried in Britain for attempting to steal property, which are the bronzes from a British museum. This courtroom reframes the restitution debate as moral questions, calls attention to colonial hypocrisy, and positions the present as a continuation of colonial injustice. The courtroom becomes a symbolic archive, a site where the past is relitigated and where visual rhetoric challenges written records. The third is constraint as method, stylation and absence. Symbol and affect carried the weight of the missing artifacts. Because Assmann lacked access to authentic sites, funding, costumes, and even museum quality bronzes, he relied on stylized sets, symbolic lighting, spiritually inflected sound, gestural reenactments, binaural motifs, and a lot of imagination. This stylization is not a flaw, it becomes an aesthetic vocabulary that communicates the lot itself. The absence of real artifacts becomes a cinematic presence, reminding audience of dispossession. The fourth is anti-colonial aesthetics and political stakes. The film situates itself within global restitution debates by emphasizing sovereignty, humiliation, cultural continuity, and the humanity of Benin victims. It participates in a broader political discourse about the return of Benin artifacts to Nigeria. And we started to see the rewards of the whole argument because some of the artifacts have been returned. The fifth is memory impact. For many Nigerian viewers, Evasion 18, including myself, Evasion 1897 is the first encounter with the Benin story. The film thus becomes a pedagogical tool, a public memory anchor, a nationalist text, and an emotional archive. It's a cultural reclamation act. Evasion 1897 functions as a museum in motion, a cinematic sanctification of a wounded history. The second case study, October 1, 2014, directed by Kunle Afolayan, I look at independence as fragmented memory. Kunle Afolayan's October 1, made in 2014, is perhaps Nollywood's most visually ambitious historical reconstruction of the independence period. It functions on two levels. The first is that it is a detective thriller, as we all know. It's also a psychological portrait of national ambivalence. The film interrogates the contradiction of 1960, a moment celebrated as triumph, but haunted by tensions, violence, and unresolved colonial residues. So the first thing I'll look at is independence as emotional disorientation. When official narratives frame independence as joy, while official narratives frame independence as a joyous occasion, October 1 frames it as tense, fearful, morally complex, and ethnically suspicious. The film opening scenes has, misty landscapes, anxious conversations, radio broadcasts that are rather gloomy, which establish independence not as liberation, but as uncertainty. This is an alternative historiography showing independence as psychological rupture rather than patriotic climax. The second is the problem of props, forgetting as production challenge. Afolayan sourced, like I said, most of the period props from abroad. This is not trivial, this is testimony. The absence of local props indicates weak archival culture, fragile memory history, institutional amnesia, and the disappearance of everyday objects that could ground national memory. Thus, the film is forced to import memory. This act becomes a metaphor. Nigeria cannot find its own past, so the props itself becomes historiographic evidence of this. The third is colonial legacies and indigenous violence. The narrative centers on a series of murders in the Yoruba mission school town. While the detective plot anchors the story, the deeper narrative concerns, racialized violence, sexual trauma, colonial schooling as psychological weapon, elite complicity, moral hypocrisy. The killer is a victim of colonial sexual abuse, a symbol of psychological injuries of imperialism, but this trauma is hidden beneath the celebratory veneer of independence. The fourth is the frame, ambivalence over triumph. Afolayan frames independence with shadows, muted lighting, and moral ambiguity. The final scene suggests that the new nation inherits unresolved colonial wounds. This is a radical departure, like I said earlier, from state narratives which portray independence as clean and triumphant. And the final theme is memory impact. A generation of Nigerians born after the 1990s now visualize independence through the aesthetics of this film. The film becomes the working memory of 1960 for many Nigerians, a substitute to textbook, archives, or museums. And it's even interesting to note that at the premiere, so many of the props and costumes of the 1960s were brought, and the press and the people that attended were able to interact with them. The third case study, 76, domestic lens and the memory of military trauma. Izu Ojukwu 76 revisits the events surrounding the 1976 coup that led to the assassination of General Murtala Muhammad. Unlike many films about coup, it resists spectacle. Instead, it frames the political crisis through everyday life. The first theme is the domestic frame. The film's narrative centers on Suzanne, which is Ramsey Noah's character's wife, as well as themes of emotional anxiety, family gossip, barrack surveillance, gender expectations, and so on. So by focusing on the intimate sphere, the film reframes the coup as lived experience rather than elite history. So this is like a deeply feminist intervention in Nigerian political cinema. We also have the theme of censorship, fear, and representation. Self-censorship and fear of reprisal kept blood off screen. Because Nigerian cinema operates under a system where political criticism and censorship can lead to a lot of scrutiny, ban, Ojukwu uses implication, emotional acting, music, and off-screen violence to convey trauma without explicit confrontation. So constraint becomes style. The fourth thing is costume sets and visual language of the 1970s. The film meticulously reconstructs uniforms, hairstyles, automobiles, interior design, and even speech patterns. Yet, these reconstructions were hard to achieve due to scarce archival materials. So 76 uses a blend of actual historical photographs, oral accounts, memory fragments for veterans, and the director's imagination. So memories becomes a collage. The fourth is emotional memory as against political memory. So rather than presenting the coup as a national turning point, the film shows fear, suspicion, marital strain, psychological fatigue. This positions the past not as a political event, but an emotional landscape. And the last of the themes here is memory impact. Today, many younger Nigerians, just like October 1, recall the 1976 saga through 76, the film, and not through textbooks or historical accounts. So the film becomes a form of national emotional memory. Now I'll look at the strengths of real history. The sense of real history lies in the democratization of history. The fact that it brings the past to audiences who may never enter museums or read monographs. It also lies in emotional accessibility. As cinema conveys trauma, empathy, dignity, and resilience through embodiment. Real history serves as counter-historiography, as filmmakers challenge colonial and elite-centered versions of events. Real history is also cultural revival, as films revive forgotten fashion, customs, languages, and value, and it is community building, as they offer shared images and metaphors through which societies understand themselves. If there are strengths, there are also limits. The limits of real history. The medium is not perfect, and indeed no medium is perfect. And historical cinema has structural limits. These limits include timeline compression, as narratives condense years into hours. That's the nature of film anyway. Simplifying complexity. There is character flattening, as historical figures become symbolic or moralized. There has to be the element of drama and tension anyway. But then there's character flattening as historical figures actually become symbolic or moralized. There is also aestheticized trauma, as violence may be beautified to fit genre conventions. There is ideological bias, as directors bring personal and ethnic frames into reconstruction. There is scarcity-induced distortion, as improvised props, borrowed costumes, or inaccurate setting may distort historical detail. Finally, there's always a choice between spectacle and fidelity, as the pressure to entertain can override fidelity to nuance. But these limitations are not fatal. They simply remind us that film is interpretation, not replication. It is a vital, affective, communal form of historical negotiation. I'll begin my conclusion now by looking at cinema as the people's archive. Nigerian historical cinema reveals a profound truth about societies with fragile archival infrastructures. When former memory systems fail or falter, cultural production rises to fill the gap. In the Nigerian context, marked by colonial erasure, inconsistent documentation, curricular gaps, and ongoing political instability, film has become a vital repository for collective memory. It stores meanings, emotions, conflict, aspiration, and wounds that the states have been unwilling or unable to preserve. Across Invasion 1897, October 1 and 76, we see filmmakers assuming the role of archivists, educators, public historians, and cultural critics. They work under intense pressure and constraints, from technical to financial to political. Yet they still manage to produce historical narrative that resonates deeply with the audiences. You cannot take that away from them. Their films circulate widely, embedding themselves in popular consciousness, shaping how Nigerians imagine their past and influencing how they interpret ongoing national issues. This paper has argued that the relationship between historical film and memory in Nigeria cannot be understood simply but through the questions of accuracy or fidelity. Instead, it must be analyzed through three key dynamics: framing as historiography, production ecology as memory architecture, and cinema as cultural memory infrastructure. For the first, framing as historiography, films frame events through narrative choices, aesthetic decision, and affective cues. This frames becomes a cognitive scaffolding for understanding history. What audiences remember is not necessarily the event, but the cinematic version of the event. Production ecology and memory architecture. Scarcity, improvisation, constraint, and infrastructural weaknesses shape the very texture of historical films. The absence of props becomes a metaphor for national forgetting. The stylization of royal courts becomes an aesthetic response to inaccessible histories. The omission of on-screen violence in political films reflects censorship pressures. The production environment itself inscribes memory. Cinema as cultural memory infrastructure. Historical films participate in the broader creative economy by generating value through heritage circulation, cultural export, and diasporic identity building. They do memory work as part of their economic function. They become cultural infrastructure, portable museums, mobile archives, and affective libraries. Now, these insights position Nigerian historical cinema not as merely entertainment, but as an epistemic and cultural system. Real history becomes a site of meaning-making, a method of communal negotiation, and a mechanism through which unresolved national questions are revisited and reimagined. Ultimately, the significance of Nigerian historical film or cinema lies not in whether it perfectly reproduces the past, but in the capacity to activate the past in the present, to transform history from static fact into lived, shared, felt experience. Through film, Nigerians encounter not only what happened, but what it meant and what it continues to mean as the nation evolves. Now, in this sense, real history does not simply represent the real, it continually remakes it. It is the people's archive in motion. It is history with heartbeat and breath. It is the nation's memory carried in light. And as we have seen, historical cinema in Nigeria does far more than reconstruct events. It helps a nation remember itself. Okay. So when I say real history is the people's archive, I mean that it is where memory finds breath, where history finds emotion, and where the past becomes something the present can hold. In these films, Nigerians encounter not only what happened, but why it still matters. Thank you very much.